get started because I was trained that it was always important to start on time for those that made the effort to show up on time. My name is Jesse Moore. I'm the chair of the Homeowners Association Board this year. Before we get going, just to introduce the other board members. Over here is Bill Art. Bill heads our communications committee, and he's largely put together the presentation you'll see. Mark Plumley in the back, he's our treasurer. And then Bill Kiesling is my predecessor as the chair, and he began the process of the covenants and looking at what we need to do, if anything, as far as changes. So those board members, a little bit about me. I'm a almost 23-year resident of the association. I've lived in 2 homes in the neighborhood, one for about 7.5 years, and I'm in the current home. I've been in that for about 16 years, so going on 24 years, I think it is, that I've lived out here. Couple of other things before we get into this, just a little bit of housekeeping. Speeding and parking, we get asked every year about this, and we get notes about it all through the year. We can't do anything about that other than ask fellow residents. The streets don't belong to us, they belong to Metro. We repeatedly ask people, to be quite honest with you, most of the time the offenders are our residents. They're not outside parties to the neighborhood. So what I try to tell residents is think of the streets as being like France, and everything off the streets is the U.S. We can ask France to slow down on the streets, but we can't make them do stuff on their property. And again, we repeatedly ask that. Same thing with dogs, barking dogs. We can't do anything about that other than ask the fellow neighbors, and we do that as well. We routinely ask them to do that, but that's all governed by Metro noise ordinances and leash laws. That's not the board that can govern that. The paving, I know many of you have seen that some of the manholes have been blacktopped, and we had indicated we expect the streets to be paved. We don't know when. All I can tell you is in speaking to Charlie, he's indicated to me that the purchase order has already been put in or processed. Now it's a matter of timing as to when the asphalt mills will open back. He did not expect it would be before April 15th. We do not know what streets. I would make the assumption that if you have manholes on your street that have been blacktopped over, that street will probably get paved. I don't know that that means streets that do not have blacktop manholes won't get paved, but we just don't know at this point. Again, we're at the mercy of Metro. So if we get into the presentation just before we start, we are here to go over nothing but the existing rules. We are not here making a presentation for changes. We're not here recommending language adds, language deletes. We are here solely to discuss the existing rules. And the reason for that is last year when we made the presentation in November, I think it was, and I saw a lot of the postings that were going up on Nextdoor and all that back and forth, it was very clear to me that we had residents, some of which didn't know we had rules, some knew we had rules but felt the rules were optional, some felt we had rules but they were selective. And so I went back to the board and basically said, I don't think there's a path forward in this process if we don't zero base and make sure that all our residents understand what our existing rules are, that we have rules and what their obligations to those rules are. So, that being said, everybody that lives in the association is bound by the rules. They're not selective. You can't choose that, well, you know, I don't like the part about grass mowing, but I like the part about this. You have to, you're bound by those rules. So just to kind of set that as well. A little bit about, I'm going to come back at the end and talk a little bit about what the ARC does in terms of enforcement of the rules. To go over those because that did come up and was discussed at the meeting last time. Let's see what else. Okay. All right. So we're going to move into the presentation, and this is kind of what we're going to go over. I'm going to talk a little bit about the rules. I'm going to talk about the ARC, how it's in detail. We're going to have Susan. She's a realtor, and she's going to come up and kind of speak from a realtor's perspective as to the importance of a homeowners association and how that fits in from a realtor's perspective, and we'll certainly take questions at the end. I think it's important to note, and again, this goes back to what I saw on the next door comments and other comments, where I think many of our residents feel like it's we board members just deciding what we think is right and forcing that down on everybody. And so if you look up there, when these covenants were put into effect, they were back in the late 80s when the neighborhood was just getting started as a development. There wasn't a single person in this room that had any input, including me, into the rules that exist today. It was simply a developer who, when it became time to get his or her bond back, had to put in place some rules. And to me, at least, it's very clear, it looks like they just went to one of their friends or somewhere and pulled some generic set of rules back, and in the name slot put in Poplar Creek Estates. And I think it's very clear, and I've talked with board members and certainly residents, that when these rules were put into effect, they were really rules that were built more around an association when it was in a build phase. And we've had, I think, 5 phases of build. We're now done with that. So if you look at our covenants, they're largely written around a time when houses would be going up, and not so much around a neighborhood where all the lots are full, there's houses, and we're more of what I would refer to as a maintenance phase. To me, it's sort of intuitive that you can't have gutters hanging off the side of your house. But as you'll see, we have nothing in the covenants that explicitly states that. I'm not saying that that's what it needs to be, but it makes it difficult for us as board members when it comes time to enforce rules. You will have somebody that comes back and says, it does not say thou shalt not have a rusted gutter on the front of the house. So then it puts it in the hands of all of us, and obviously we change over the years, and so you get another board that comes in and they decide, we don't think that was right. And that has its own set of issues. So, as I said, bullets 2 and 3 are really more or less why you have rules and regulations. It's to set in place, amenities or things like sidewalks, street lights, things like that. But it's more to govern. These were set in place more to govern around, what you could and couldn't do, but also they're there to protect private property value, and I think Susan will speak to that when she does her portion. Okay, so most of my focus is going to really be around Article 3 of the covenants, and let me say one thing before I go any further. There's bylaws and there's covenants. The bylaws govern how the board operates. The covenants are really the homeowner's rules that basically say what you can and can't do with your properties, and if you want to make changes, the processes that you need to follow. So that's the difference between what you'd refer to as bylaws and covenants, and we're really talking more or less today around the covenants. Articles 1 and 2, I'm not really going to spend a lot of time because, again, this is more when it was getting started, so it's definitions around what's common area, what's a lot, that kind of stuff. And then Article 2 talks mainly about who's subject to it, which is basically all the property owners, etc. Article 3 is where I want to focus most of the discussion. Because it stipulates what the rules are, the covenants that govern your properties, what you can and can't do. And again, what I'm saying is, these are the rules that were adopted and put in place for the association, not by this board or a prior board, but they were put in place by the developer, and we're all bound to it. So, architectural review, and I'm going to spend more time on that when I come back a little bit later, but it specifies the makeup of that board and exactly what they're going to do. And again, I'm going to come back to that. The next 2 paragraphs really speak more or less about what the ARC's role is and what your role is related to the ARC. And I would tell you today that what we have historically, at least when I've been on the board, our focus has been to say to residents, if you're doing anything to the exterior of your home, it's in your best interest to let the ARC know what that is. We can tell you almost immediately whether you're going to need to submit a plan or whether no, that's not going to be an issue. But that's really what that speaks to. And again, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the ARC, okay? So there's a rule around parking on the street in large vehicles and boats. And as you can see, it says boats and large vehicles. So from my perspective, from my fellow board members' perspective, what's a large vehicle? Is a large vehicle a one-ton dually? Some people in here might say that's not a large vehicle. Other people may say it is. So what I would submit to you is that do we need more clarity around what that is in definition so that we don't put the board in the position, and again, you see comments that the board's forcing its will down on people. I don't know what that definition is. So what that means is if we get a request from a neighbor, and believe me, we do, that somebody's got their off-street vehicle out on a trailer sitting on the street, then it puts it in our hands to try to interpret what does large vehicle mean. And so we may come to the annual meeting and we may have 3 people that agree with what we did, and we may have everybody else in the room say we don't agree with that. So we need to come up with what is that, okay? Temporary buildings. You know, there's, I had one request one time, this is my 10th year on the board, not consecutive, but I had a request one time from a resident that said, you know, drive over to Home Depot. They have some really nice looking storage sheds now that are really well built, good materials, good color, etc. And I think we ought to look into allowing those. I don't consider those a shack. You know, do you see treehouse up there? We've had somebody come to us about tree houses. So it puts the onus on us to try to figure out where does that fit. And I'm not saying any of us are in agreement or disagreement. I think that needs to be determined by the association at large. It's not the board's determination, but we get forced into that position if we get a submission for a treehouse. We have to look at it, okay? Yard maintenance, this is probably the one that comes up the most, where either we observe it or we get complaints from neighbors. I personally speaking see my home as my #1 asset. So I see it as important to maintain my property and keep it looking nice and neat, my shrubs not dead, all that. But these covenants really say nothing more than a general statement about the yard can't be above 8 inches. Well, I would submit to you that depending on type of grass, some people, if they keep their yard mowed at 9 inches, it probably doesn't look that bad. So does that mean what do we need to do? It just says generally neat and trim. What does that mean? We have homes in the neighborhood now that have absolutely no landscaping on the front. They've ripped it completely out and decided to put nothing out there. And does that affect property values? Is that what the neighborhood wants to see? We don't know the answer to that question. But we get complaints, and usually it's surrounding neighbors who don't want to make enemies with their neighbors, but they want us to do something about it. And then we look at it and say, well, there's really not anything in there, and then we're forced to try to come to a consensus on it. Business and trade. You know, this is something that with the technological age, that's coming more into play. Now, that does not mean, at least in my opinion, that doesn't mean that somebody can't work from their house. What I interpret that to mean is you can't set up a dress shop or a smocking shop in your house and have the general public pulling up and parking in front of your home and coming in and you've got a room set up with the clothes on racks. That's what I think that's intended to mean. But do we need to put some clarity around it? Signs. This is another one. Today, do you realize that the rule today says the only thing that's permissible is a for sale sign? that any other sign that goes in the yard, technically you're in violation. Now, I happen to believe that I don't have an issue that at graduation time, if somebody wants to put their child's sign out in the yard, somebody has a baby, somebody's doing work on the house, alarms, I think those are perfectly acceptable, but our covenants don't address them. So it forces us as board members to try to interpret that. Political signs, that's another one that comes up. I don't have an issue with that, but I don't think they should be out in the yards for 6 months. And what I find most of the time with signs is people put their sign out in the yard and we drive by and 3 months later the sign's still in the yard, yet they pull out of the driveway every day, and then we do get calls from neighbors that say, what are you doing about that sign? We believe it or not, this first one, the association, I was not on the board at the time, but we had to take somebody to court. They went and tried to turn their house into a multi-family home where they had a second person, second family moving in and living in part of the house, and we had to go and fight them, and it took a lot of time, it took a lot of resource, and we basically got our money back, but we got it corrected. So it does come into play. You have the issue about driveways and garages. Animals. Believe it or not, this has come up. When I was on the board one time, I got a notice from a couple of residents that there was somebody that had exotic birds, and this person had built this elaborate wooden aviary out in the back and had these exotic birds living out there. And we had to tell the resident that they couldn't. So do we need to look at expanding that? I've actually had somebody call me, believe it or not, I think, and wanted us to consider fencing the common areas in order to keep the deer in, because they felt the deer were eating the plants on their property. Metal storage buildings, clotheslines. What's a metal storage building? Is that a pod? Today, there's nothing about pods. And back when these covenants went into effect in '87, pods, I don't think really existed. So the question is, do we need to have something in there, some language that says, if you have a pod, you have to notify your resident, your neighbors, you have to notify the association, you have a week, you have to get permission. If it's more than a week, what do we do there? Because we've gotten complaints where people have had pods put out front and they sit there for 3 or 4 months. And I personally speaking, again, at my home, I wouldn't do that to my neighbors. So I wouldn't put a pod out front and leave it for 3 or 4 months. I would tell my neighbors I'm moving and I'm going to have a pod out here. It'll be here for a week. If it ran over, I'd certainly communicate. Mailboxes. This is another one it's always a challenge because people run into mailboxes, trucks hook the mailbox and bend it, the mailbox gets dented. The way the covenants are written today, everybody has to have the same mailbox design, Herndon and Mary, and the same color. Although the color says Bellmead green. Well, I'm a native Nashvilleian, lived here all my life. If I drive over to Bellmead and look at their street signs, I suppose that's what Bellmead green is. It looks to me like it's black, but it says Bellmead green. So we do have one resident that has a mailbox that's green. And his claim is, well, my mailbox is Bellmead green. Yours are all black. So do we need to do something with respect to that? Article 4 is really around, voting rights, fees, proxies, all of those kinds of things. We set dues every year at the annual meeting. It's discussed at the annual meeting, which, by the way, I would say to any and all of you in this room that you have a vote. So it's important for you to come down to that meeting and make an effort to be at that meeting. What we routinely see, again, this is my 10th year on the board, what I see is it's the same residents show up every year, and the board members are asked to get proxies, because if they didn't get proxies, we wouldn't have enough people to conduct business. So we try to get proxies just to conduct business. And it's important because what happens is then we put something into effect, we discuss it with the residents that are there. If the residents there object or want us to go back and rethink, we've always pretty much done that. But if you're not there, then we get a barrage of people complaining, you don't have the right to do this, you shouldn't do this, whatever. Well, you know, where were you at the meeting? Nobody came to the meeting and told us and voiced opinion on it. So we are looking at, as a result of the last meeting we had, we're going to look into what we can do as possibly allowing things to be electronic, if at all possible. We realize that people have commitments to family, work, school, those types of things, which is why we're having 3 of these meetings, because we wanted to have a couple on weeknights and one on the weekend to try to hopefully accommodate everybody's schedule to allow them to be present and to ask questions. Okay? So one thing I'd like to get away from is requiring those written proxies for the meeting. And I mean, not take it out here, but board members having to go do that. I'd like to have enough residents show up that we don't have to go asking for proxies, because I personally, all I do with the proxies, if I get them, is just to count those residents so we can do business. If we were going to have some major vote on some major issue, I don't think I would use anybody's proxy. I'd only vote what my rights are unless I went to you and discussed it with you first, because I would not want to vote on your behalf, although I have the right to do that if you give me a proxy.
How many homes are in our association?
365 approximately, 365. Okay, the common areas. All I'll say about the common areas, they belong to each of us in equal proportions. We have the only usable common area that I know of is the one that's down there on Lower Autumnwood behind the school, right after you turn off Collinswood. And that's typically where we'll have a block party if we have it, where we have an Easter egg hunt. There's really no other common area that I know of that is something where we could have the association get together, unless you wanted to have a party in a ditch, a drainage ditch, and walk down hills. But we're required to maintain those. And if we don't, Metro codes can come out and do it and back bill us for it. So you have the right to go on the common area, but that's the only one that we really effectively use in the neighborhood. Okay. One more thing I want to say about the easements at the bottom, because this is important, particularly for anybody that's doing work on their house. The utility companies, I believe, if I'm correct, our covenants say that on the sides, there's a 5-foot utility easement, which I would refer to as a setback from your side boundaries, and a 10-foot from the back boundary, where they have easements, which that basically means they can come on the property, they don't have to ask your permission, and they can start digging to do work on utilities. So if you're going to build a deck, or you're going to build an extension on your home, a sunroom, those are things you have to be aware of. When we do, and I'm going to talk about this in the ARC, we don't approve submissions for easements. That's the homeowner's responsibility. And believe it or not, just because you have that rear easement, it doesn't mean that necessarily there's not a drainage pipe running diagonally through your property. And if you build an extension on your home and something happens and they got to get to it, guess what? They can knock down that part of your house and they don't have to ask you. And technically, they don't have to repair it. Okay. I talked a little bit about this. Liens. We don't typically like to do those. I'm going to talk more about that when I get into some of the ARC's role as rule enforcement. Special assessment, I've never known that to happen, but what I would describe that as is that if we didn't have a rainy day fund and we had some major storm blow through and knock down a bunch of trees and do damage to common areas that we had to repair, and we didn't have that money, then that's built in there where we could say it's gonna be $10,000, divide that by 365, we're gonna have to assess everybody this amount of money. And you can see it really defines how we would have to go about doing all that. We have the right today that if somebody doesn't comply, say with mowing, we have the right to send a mowing service on the property to cut it and bill the homeowner for that. Now, we don't like to do that. Most of the mowing companies won't do that for legal reasons. And believe it or not, we've tried it before, and one of the residents came out the door with a machete chasing after the mower, all because the property looked like a cow pasture or a field. So we're volunteers, we're trying to do what's best for the neighborhood according to what the rules are, not what our personal preferences are. But personal preferences among the board members, that comes into play when we don't have rules that specifically define, then it does fall back on the board. And you can see at the very bottom, again, if we fail to maintain our common areas, then Metro Zoning has the right to take appropriate action to bring them within codes. Talk about easements. And what can be done in terms of violations. So again, I don't want to get into too much detail. Most of my focus, I think, wanted to be on Article 3, which was really specific rules, because I think that's a lot of what we're focusing on. I don't think it means these don't need to be looked at, but I think those are the key areas that we need to look at. So one of the things that I just noted in preparing for the meeting was that what you won't see in these covenants, that gazebos, pools, tree houses, fences today are addressed, but it says only wood. Well, I happen to think that, I personally speaking, doesn't mean that's what needs to be, but I think there's wrought iron fencing that looks rather nice. But this developer, when the rules got thrown together, wrought iron wasn't in there. None of us were in a room to discuss and say, hey, you ought to put wrought iron in there. So today, if you submitted something that said wrought iron, technically, we're required to say, sorry, we don't care how nice it looks and how much we think it looks good, we'd have to reject it to be in compliance with the rules. So there's a lot of things that are today. Solar panels, that's another one, and you'll see when I do the visual portion. These are things that really didn't exist, pods, when these covenants were put into effect. Okay? So a little bit about the Architectural Review Committee. I'm going to talk about its makeup, what its role is, and then the process for approvals and decisions. So today we have our ARC is comprised of 3 people, although we're looking for another person on the board to step in because one of our board members decided to step down. But we typically function with 3 board members on that committee. And one of those 3 is chosen or agrees to serve as the chair of that board. And it's typically an annual term, but many of these individuals, since board terms are 3 years, they may agree to stay on multiple years. But it can change at any time during the year, or it can change annually, or it may be several years that those members, that the makeup changes, the individuals. So there's really a couple, bullets 2 and 3 kind of go together, but there's really 2 roles of the ARC. One is to enforce the rules and regulations or the restrictive covenants, and the other one is to review submitted plans and make decisions of approval or disapproval for what somebody may want to do to the exterior of their home. We're really not, I don't know of any provision that allows us to discuss anything on the interior of the home. So, I mean, you wouldn't submit, well, I want to paint my dining room blue, and we'd say, sorry, you can't do it, we don't like it. But if you're gonna put a front door on, you know, I would suggest that it be submitted, but again, that's something you'll see. We don't have anything in the covenants around that. So should the covenant say a black door, a white door? Should the covenant say it's up to the board that's in power at the time? We don't know, but those requests come in, and we get somebody that sends a fuchsia door, and we're scratching our heads, well, I wonder what everybody, we kind of don't, the 8 of us don't think it looks good, or 5 of the 8 of us think it looks good, and 3 don't. What about the neighbors? Have you talked to your neighbors? I would say to you, if you're doing anything with the exterior of your home, while it's not required, I would personally, as a courtesy to my neighbors, say, look, I'm going to put a pool in. It's going to be right here. They're going to be starting on this day. I've got approval. It's going to be this. Do you have any problem? Do you have any issues with it? So you can, if you're going to do anything in the exterior of your home, these are the ways that you can submit to the board your plan. And we have a form that requires you to provide a sketch and description of what you're doing, and these are the ways that it can be submitted. We have 45 days to review it. That doesn't mean we take 45 days. But what I would say to all of you, and I said at the last meeting, I'll say at the next meeting, is don't make your decision with your contractor, and the contractor says, I'm ready to start Monday, and then ground starts breaking, and then we drive by and see, and we're like, wait a minute, what is this? Well, I'm putting in a driveway extension. Well, wait a minute. What's the material going to be? Where is it going to be? And then we're put in a position of having awkwardly to go to you and say, you got to stop until we figure it out. Because if we let you go and it's not done right, then guess what? We're going to get a barrage of phone calls from the surrounding neighbors saying, hey, the guy next door's got an aggregate driveway, and he put in an extension, and it's just plain white cement. And it doesn't look right, and I don't like it. And if it's in violation of the covenants, we typically have the right to say, you have to tear it up and do it again. And we obviously don't want to do that. Okay? A little bit about the submitted. So the chair will review it and share it with the other members. So I think the important point there is you don't have one member of the ARC making the decision. That person typically looks at it, shares with the others, look, I think I'm going to approve this. I don't see anything that's out of line with the covenants. If those people say, well, look, wait a minute, this is something I think we ought to discuss, we have that built into the process. If they can't come to an agreement, or it's something that is not addressed, they may bring it back to us, the full board. So like, I would expect if somebody puts in a pool, there's nothing about pools. So it usually would come back to all of us, you know, what do we want to do? Do we want to approve it? Do we not want to approve it? Okay? A little bit about the criteria, because I think this is important. Our review is only for compliance to the covenants, to the rules and restrictions. We don't look for safety. So you're not going to get something back from us that says, I see you're putting up a deck, it looks pretty nice, but geez, you're using 4x4s as your posts, not 6x6s. That won't happen. That's your responsibility to know codes and build to codes, and probably your builder. If you select a builder, they're going to know that, but we don't approve for that. Property lines. We're going to tell you on the form that we give back to you that you have to initial. The approval does not address property lines. That is solely your responsibility. We're approving that, yes, your deck meets the restrictive covenants, but it's your responsibility to know your property lines and build your deck on your property and within setback requirements, etc. Again, personal preferences, that doesn't come into play unless we have a situation where somebody's submitting something to us that's not addressed. Then it does become an issue where we as a board have to make a decision, and we're trying to, well, do you think an above ground pool looks okay? Is an above ground pool okay, but not with, caricature whales all around the side of it, in full view of the street? It forces us to take a look at that. But generally speaking, we wouldn't look at your deck and say, you know, octagonal doesn't look good to us. No, we think it ought to be square. We wouldn't do that. So we notify the homeowner. We have a document that we have people initial. I know when I was on the ARC on a prior term on the board, I would go to the home and I would sit down and I would tell them, it's approved, but these 5 or 6 things you need to initial, and I'd go through those. You understand that your responsibility to know your property lines, your responsibility to know any kind of codes, your responsibility to get permits. It's your responsibility to clean up the mess when it's done. Your responsibility to know that you can't dump stuff in the ditch or alter drainage, that you have to follow whatever requirements are that might impact that. Okay? So the homeowner's responsibilities are, again, property lines, setback requirements, knowing where your utilities are, local codes, permits, disturbance or alteration of the drainage, and then cleanup of the property. And believe it or not, in my almost 24 years here, I have seen building projects and I've seen mounds of dirt and gravel sitting out in the yard for months at a time. Okay, so what we're going to do now, and again, we will have time for questions, is I'm going to ask Susan to come up. Susan Thetford, she's a realtor, and as I said at the last meeting, in the interest of full disclosure, she doesn't represent any board members. She hasn't sold any of us homes. We have not listed homes with her, but I've asked Susan to come in and just speak to you briefly about the importance of an association and from a realtor's perspective, how they look at that when they deal with their customers who are prospective buyers or sellers.
Can I ask one quick
Yes.
question first? What is the plan of the boards for when you will go about proposing or suggesting new guidelines?
I think what we wanted to do was have these 3 meetings. The board wanted to reconvene from those 3 meetings and then kind of set a process forward. I would expect the process forward would be, we would have additional neighborhood meetings where we would solicit input from all the neighbors that want to participate. It is, again, this is not something where the board is going to go and draft everything up and then throw it out there. The stuff that was put out in November, just to clarify, all of that was drafted by the board, but it was drafted based on stuff we had historically received over the years. So it was not something where the board sat down and said, okay, we need to do this, 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 and this. We sat down and said, well, look, we've had requests about pools, so we think we should have some language about pools. We've had requests about pods. We've had requests about lawns and upkeep. But that's what the process I would see forward. We haven't determined that yet. We wanted to have these meetings because we felt like the most important thing was to make sure everybody knew that there were rules, they're bound by the rules aren't optional, they're not selective, and then present to them what the rules are and why we think there should be some modifications made to those rules, but we want the homeowners' input. That's not going to be something we're going to draft sitting in a back room. And I know anybody that looked at the next door stuff, that was a lot of the accusation that we were sitting in a back room drafting everything, and all we were trying to do is come up with a standard and say, what do you think? Well, we disagree. We need to take this out. Okay, we'll take it under advisement, or we need to add this, etc. Okay, so Susan, if you'll.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jesse, for inviting me back. It is always so much fun to talk to people about my 3 passions, and I'm sure they're all yours: your families, your homes, and your financial security. So I won't bother you with my family. We can get into that another time. But your home and your financial security are bound together anyway, right? Your values in your home is probably the most expensive thing you will ever purchase and own. And that investment is what we're really talking about here, is preserving it, preserving the integrity of it and your values. So that's always a really fun, good conversation. Let me tell you who I am. I am Susan Thetford. I am a realtor with Parks Properties, have been a realtor since '87, basically with that company the entire time. I am also a general contractor. I have renovated or built from scratch over 37 houses, I believe, last count. I retired that license right at the end of the session, for probably everybody understands reasons why. But that, I do have that experience with it. And when Jesse was talking about, I have development experience as well, doing small developments. And he's exactly right when he says, when restrictions and covenants are recorded, it is because, that's when the bond is recorded and before the road, water, and sewer go in. When the whole plat is recorded, you have to have restrictions and covenants to go with that. And I've been a part of this whole process back in the early 80s. He's exactly right. It was basically a pro forma restriction covenant that they copied from one that they got yesterday or from 2 years ago. And the purpose of that is the developer owns and has all the investment and all the risk while the property is being developed. And he's got to put in these restrictions. At 50%, 51%. Once 51% was sold out, that was supposed to be turned over to the board, had to be set up. And also, so the developer and the board, the homeowners, then became the voice of the development. But they all completely had a time period when they ended. I don't know when yours is that they end, but they all have that in there. And the whole point is so that once the whole property is developed, every homeowner has his right, his percentage right of say of what happens in that development. And so that's how the whole thing works. And he's right. 20-something years ago, we didn't have good-looking things in the roof.
Solar panels.
Thank you. We didn't have those. There's a lot of things that nobody even knew to talk about, right? But what, from my perspective, here's what a realtor does. When Jesse calls me and says, I'm looking for a $400,000 house, show me everything you can find me within 30 minutes of home. That's what we're doing. We're showing them. We know the development, we know the areas. You all here in Bellevue are primed for your values to really rise. Because it's close proximity. People are saying, I want to be out 40 direction. The traffic's not as horrendous as some of these other areas. That's where the values are still reasonable. And put me here, this is an area that has not had the growth and it's going to have those increases. For you to keep those values high by drive-through and looking great and maintained and having that integrity is going to be huge when people drive through your areas. That's one. When I drive through an area, I can see if the grass is high, if shutters are falling off of the windows. We know where there's a strong association. And it gets kind of complicated because it can. You want your own privacy on your own home and do whatever you want to do with it. But what happens with you and what happens around you is also affecting your values and your neighbors' values. So to look maintained, to look clean, to look kempt, to look cohesive, like there is some safety and security in knowing if I buy in here, there is something that's going to keep chickens from being in the backyard of my neighbor. There's something new, and I keep thinking about this. The VRBOs, the vacation rental, what does VO stand for?
Right owner.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be it. Do you all want those? Do you want your neighbor to be able to rent out his place in five weeks out of every 7 months? Somebody comes here and lives and rents and back and forth. Those things didn't exist. And I don't think in this area there's actually any metro overlay. There is some in some of the other downtown areas of metro. But that could happen here. Is it okay with you? Until there are restrictions, your homeowners association actually is at risk because they're having to make decisions for you all. And for a unpaid volunteer organization to spend their time on that, that's kind of a risky place for you to put them in. But truly from the standpoint of, as a realtor, I know which areas, and I was a part of a group maybe Wednesday where we were talking about Bellevue. And their community is known to not be maintained. And it's hard for me to go in there and say, look, this is a good place for you to buy as a home here in Bellevue, and it's going to maintain, when I see maybe that house looks great, But that's huge, grass being mowed, that one's mailbox is falling off. It's hard for me to say, I can't say that, I won't say that, but I don't even need to, because their eyes are looking at it too. So for you to maintain your values, for you to have the integrity of knowing this is a rising tide, these people are maintaining and taking care of their property. These people look like they have a pride of ownership. That's what's gonna maintain your values, and also just the community atmosphere that you've got. You don't wanna be an adversarial kind of situation. So I know it can be kind of risky to think I wanna help, but put your input in there too. An association, and I live in one, an association where people do converse and talk about what things they would like is a place and it's a community that people know and like as well. And believe it or not, that's talked about within the real estate community. This area, the people like each other, they have things, they do things together, they enjoy what they're doing and they're cohesive. This one fights all the time. You know, when a newcomer's come into town, they ask us those questions. So, I hope that answers. Does anybody have any questions maybe for me? I guess I was totally unclear.
Thank you, Susan. All right, so this is gonna be my favorite part of it, yes.
Before we get into this, my wife already saw this. I just want to make sure. Are you assuming that this is the kind of neighbors that we have in our estate? Is this what you're trying to say?
No. No,
Okay.
not at all. I think what we're trying to say is, if we don't have a strong homeowners association, or we don't have one, then this is what the neighborhood can become. That's what I think we're trying to say. You may disagree with that, but I think that's what we're trying to illustrate, that it's important, because if we don't have rules or we don't enforce rules, then we can have properties. They may not look this bad, but they may affect property values of our overall neighborhood. So what I wanted to do here was, my wife and I drove probably toward the end of January over to a neighborhood here, and we spent about 30 minutes taking these pictures that you're going to see. And so I wanted to kind of illustrate, again, as I said to Joel, if you don't have homeowners association, or you have one where they don't enforce rules, then you can have properties that could get as bad as this, could be a little bit less than this. But I also want to illustrate in these some of the things that we don't have addressed in our covenant. So if you look at this one, besides the obvious that, you know, a car parked in the front yard, if you look at the roof, I don't think there's anything in our covenants that are very specific about the roof. So could somebody come and put a tin roof on their house? Could somebody come and put a Spanish tile roof on their house, which they're pretty nice and pretty expensive? So do we need to address something like that? Okay, you can see the landscaping's not well kept. It's the end of January, early part of February, and you can see Christmas stuff is still up on the house. Okay, here's one that has a pod in the driveway. So we don't have anything that says you need to request permission, any guidance around how long it can sit there before you need to request additional permission, where it can be placed. There may be metro ordinances that govern, because obviously some people that live on a hill, I don't think they can force somebody to put a pod on an angle like that. They may have to put it on the street. But can you put it, should you put it in your driveway? For how long should it be there? I don't think anybody on this board, there's nobody on this board that wants to go and say it is a week and that's it and tough. If it's a week, it's up and you haven't done it, well, gee, I'm sorry, I pulled my shoulder the third day in. We certainly will work with any resident. Here's another one. You can see the landscaping, a lime green palette on the front. Now, to me, that's intuitive. You can't do that. And I'm not saying we need to have a rule that says you can't put a pallet stand in front of your house, but if we went to some homeowners, they would argue with us about it. You can see down below, they've turned the garage into living space. Is that potentially for some other outside resident? And you can see along the left-hand side of the driveway, there's a bunch of debris and stuff thrown out there. Here's one, a lot of clutter on the front porch, no landscaping on the home. Again, I'm not saying that, what I'm trying to say to you is, what do the residents as a whole want? Do you want to allow for no landscaping on the front of your home, on someone's home? How does that affect our overall property values? How would you feel if your next door neighbor decided they just don't want to maintain their shrubbery, so they just rip it all out and just leave the front of the house just empty looking with all the vents there for the crawl space in full view and clutter on the front? Here's solar panels. So we have nothing on solar panels. Should we have them in there? Do we restrict them? What government guidance or ordinances say what we can and can't do? I mean, I would tend to think we wouldn't be in a position to say somebody cannot have solar panels. But we might be able to say where they're put, the size of them, the style of them. We just need to figure that out, in my opinion. This was one of my favorites, with all the, the pink flamingos and the other stuff in the yard. There's the family of ceramic deer. I mean, we don't have anything in our covenants today that if your neighbor went out and bought these and put them in the front yard, other than it would force the board to say, we don't think that looks right in the neighborhood. And then you may have somebody, that homeowner says, by golly, doesn't say anything, and I'll fight you on it because I want the ceramic deer in the front yard. Or the neighbor says, you got no right to tell them they can't do that. But we as board members, when we're functioning, as I like to say to the board members, we have to take our neighbor hat off. We're functioning with a board hat. That doesn't mean we're unfriendly, but we have to take our neighbor hat off. We can't let that influence the decisions. We have to be looking out for the good of the whole neighborhood. We cannot be looking out for our own personal interests or those of our neighbor. Just like if your neighbor were a policeman and every morning he sees you flying out of the neighborhood going double the speed, well, I don't want to ticket them because they're my neighbors and I don't want to be a bad neighbor. Here's another thing, wheelchair ramps. We don't have anything around those in our covenants, and I'm not saying that means figure out whether they're in or out, but should we set up guidelines around, do they need to be wood? Do they need to match the color of the house? What do we need to do? Because certainly with an aging population and situations where family members are forced to move in, we're going to see that come up. So believe it or not, somebody puts one of those in, guess what? The board gets a phone call from people complaining about it, and we don't have really anything to go on other than to say, well, we don't like metal, we think it should be wood, or we think it should be metal and not wood. But we as an association need to figure out what does that need to be? Does anything need to be in there? Do we need to exclude it? Do we need to set guidelines around it? That's not for me to say, or the board members. It's the association. This is one where we've had this happen. Somebody has a roof leak and the tarp sits on the roof for months. Now, I'm certainly not somebody, and none of my fellow board members or anybody that says that tarp has to come off in a week. But what I would say to a homeowner is give me some idea of a timeline, and all I can tell you is it can't stay there indeterminately or indefinitely without keeping us informed so that we can keep the surrounding neighbors, because that's what's going to happen. We're going to get the phone call saying, I live next door and I know they've had these issues and I don't want to upset my neighbor, but that tarp is driving me crazy on the roof. And then we don't know anything about it. Here's another thing, garbage can. We get phone calls about this. There's nothing in the covenants about garbage cans. So we get calls about, I don't like it on the front of the house. I don't like the fact that my neighbor leaves it sitting out on the street for 3 days and it's on its side, rolling out in the street. Should it be in the garage? Should it be around the side of the house? Should it be allowed to have 4 and 5 bags of trash out the top and all on the ground around it? We get those calls. So then we have to try to make a determination. I would tell you, just personally speaking, I think they should be in the house or out of view of the street. But that's me. It needs to be what everybody else wants, not what I want. And the board won't make that decision. But when we get that call, we have to address it. And usually we have to go to the neighbor and say, look, you know, it probably doesn't look right. You got some neighbors complaining about it. Any chance you could put it in the garage or put it out of sight or not have bags? That's about all we can do because there's nothing in there about it. You know, here's one, look, the chimney's off the house. I put this one up because you have the fence. So again, as I said earlier, we have rules, but they say the fence can only be wood. But I don't believe our rules say anything on height, anything on design. So I have a neighbor next to me that has a fence that's 8 feet tall. And is that good? Is that bad? What does everybody want? It's not addressed today, so if we get something where somebody says, I want to put up a 10-foot fence, guess what? We're all put in the position of trying to decide, well, we personally don't think it looks good, but then other neighbors are, you don't have a right to tell them that. Okay, satellite dishes. Now that's another one that I do want to talk about just for a minute, because if you look in our covenants, the satellite dishes, it says they're prohibited. But that was written at a point when digital satellite didn't exist back in the late 80s. It was those big 6-foot dishes that were in poles out in the backyard that you'd see today out in, potentially out in the surrounding counties. So what do we need to put in place? What I will tell you, I have DirecTV, so I have a satellite dish. What I will tell you is that we do have a right as an association to say where that dish goes, as long as we do not force the homeowner to spend extra money. We can't say to the homeowner, you can only put the dish on the back corner of the roof if the homeowner says, but the satellite company said they can't do it, so I have to hire somebody to come out and then it'll cost me $500. We can't do that. But I would tell you, having a satellite dish, I know for a fact that when they've shown up, they want to do it the quickest and easiest way. So for them, it's put a pole here and just run a simple line and tie it into your house, and they're done, and they're on to the next job. Whereas I know enough to say, look, it can go on the corner of the roof back here, and I know you can go up to the level of the roof, and I know you can put it up there, and I know that may take you 3 extra hours, but that's where I want it. You're going to do it that way. So if you drive through our neighborhood today, you'll see there's people that have them on their deck railing. There are people that have them in full view on the front of the house. And the question is that what we want? Do we need to put parameters around it? Does it affect our property values? Here's one where you have electrical line and hose thrown off to the left there, and you've got clutter in the front yard. Maybe it was that day, but I've driven through, and there's some homes today where some of this stuff just sits out for days and months at a time. Is that what we want? That I mentioned earlier, gutter. So you got a gutter there, and then you've got some type of vine growing up the house, a plastic chair, and again, this is the end of January, and look there, there's still the pumpkin on the front porch. So we have nothing today if somebody puts icicle lights up on the front of their house, and it's March, We don't have anything that says in a reasonable period of time, you have to take your decorations down, you can't leave them up year round, they can't be lighting, Christmas lights can't be lighting in April. Is that what people want? It's, again, it's for the association to decide.